tonight we are back with the second of our bookend for the week. We are talking about another Spike Lee film. We began on Monday with Do the Right Thing, and now we're talking about his latest film from Netflix called Da 5 Bloods. It is a it is sort of a Vietnam War movie, but a very unconventional one, unlike any that I've ever seen, and it's very much a Spike Lee movie. So I'm joined once again by Emmanuel Noisette from EMan's Movie Reviews and David Fowlie from Keeping It Real. Don Shanahan of Every Movie Has a Lesson was unable to join us tonight, but we will be linking to his review at Every Movie Has a Lesson in the description of this YouTube video and or podcast link, however we set that up. So be sure to look out for that. All right, so Da 5 Bloods. EMan, do you want to give the synopsis for what this film is, if you can do it in a synopsis fashion? Because there's a lot going on in this thing.
Oh man, that's a huge burden. I look, 5 Bloods is an interesting tale of 5 friends, Vietnam friends, Black Americans who served in the war, and they are on a mission, a personal mission at that. One for how could I say, a certain treasure, maybe, and
it's in the trailer.
Yeah, and two to find the remains of their leader or their captain, played by Chadwick Boseman, and yeah, what ensues is very interesting. Lots and lots of stuff happen.
Yeah. I think we are all in agreement, I would assume, that this is a very squeaky chair. No,
sorry.
That this is at the very least a very good movie. So I think that can probably serve as our high-level spoiler-free critique of the movie, and we'll just get right into spoilers. So if you have not watched Da 5 Bloods, it's on Netflix right now as you're watching this. So pause this. Watch it. It's going to take some time because it's 2.5 hours long, but it's well worth it. And then come back and listen to our thoughts. So you've been warned. I didn't watch the trailer for this movie. I had just heard, hey, it's the new Spike Lee movie. It's a kind of band of brothers going back to Vietnam to find something, and that's all I knew. I'm like, all right, I'm in. The cast is great. Can't wait to see what they do with this. And yeah, it's as hard a movie as to describe as it is to quantify with, I think, one viewing. I've only seen it, once. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to watch it more than once. I'll definitely be going back to it.
Yeah.
But it's a weird film with sort of these, over that 2.5 hours, there are so many intermittent moments of just power and rage and emotion that I was completely swept up. And that's to say that there are other parts of the film where I thought were just kind of strange. And I'm not sure that I would have melded all 3 movies that this thing is into one picture, but I would have liked to have seen separate movies dealing with kind of each of these topics. Since we're talking spoiler territory, I guess we can just go all in. But there's the guys going back to Vietnam to recover the gold and their friend's body. There is the subplot or I guess the plot that kind of spins off of that, where there's a French or an international group of bomb deactivators. Yeah. And then there's also the group run by Jean Reno, who is sort of the people who are hoping to get their hands on the gold. And he is like a crazy major Trump allegory, even though he's French. There's all of this weird stuff going on. And a lot of it ties back to this unique flashback structure where these old men, who are all in their probably 60s and 70s by now, have flashbacks to Vietnam and this incident that happened with their friend, who was, the 5th blood. In the present day, there's only 4 of them because they're looking for one guy's remains. When we go back to Nam, Chadwick Boseman is his, age. He's in his, 20s or whatever. But everyone else is in their 60s and 70s. And I didn't know this, again, not having seen the trailer, but watching it in the film, I was like, wait, is Delroy Lindo, was he supposed to be old back in Vietnam and now he's just really old? Oh, no, everyone's like that.
Yeah.
The one thing
Yeah.
I'll say is at the end of the film, they're doing these sort of photo montages, and one of the stills we see is of Chadwick Boseman and the rest of the gang, but they're in what looks to be really poor young person or de-aging makeup. I don't know if that was a test or a choice that they abandoned. I'm really glad they did because I don't know if I could have watched that for 2.5 hours.
That's also in the beginning of the film, really quick too.
Okay,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
missed that part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what did you guys think of everything that's going on? Was there something that, we'll talk themes and stuff in a little bit, but just as far as the story and, the stories that are unfolding here, what did you make of them? What was your favorite? What was your least favorite? Did you have a least favorite? Did all of it work for you?
Good grief.
David, go for it.
Wow. This movie really moved me. I got choked up several times. You know, the trailer for this came out during the pandemic, right? Am I? Yeah,
I don't know. I
mid-March.
didn't watch it, so I wouldn't be able to say.
Okay. Anyway, I remember watching the trailer and I was thinking, "Wow, I'm actually looking forward to a movie." Because I was just. It just seems like movies are so uncertain now, right? Just like an event kind of thing. And this just felt like in my wheelhouse. I like war movies and I like movies about friendships and especially looking at older friendships, like friendships that have maintained the test of time, whatever they've gone through. That interests me. But man, and then seeing Spike Lee tackle like a war film, I was like, wow, okay. But you are right. I mean, this does feel like a Spike Lee joint. But also, while I was watching it, I'm like, while I was watching it, I felt the way I felt when I first saw Oliver Stone's Platoon. I also felt like man, this is kind of like an epic journey, like something like Scorsese would make or something. It just felt like. I mean, it has that Spike Lee touch where he's educating us, yeah, throughout. He's also, taking some jabs here and there, rightly so. I mean, it's his perspective, it's his film. I get it. It's not subtle, which is fine. But what I really appreciate about the movie is that it's grounded in these four friends, and yes, it's called The Five Bloods, and there is a new blood in the movie that goes along for the ride, kind of surprisingly, and I think that was pretty fitting and poignant.
Yeah.
And that's one of the Bloods' sons, David, and that's sorry, that's Paul's son, Paul's Delroy Lindo's character, and I just felt like that was an interesting touch because now you do have five Bloods, even though they're out there looking for the fifth blood. That their dynamic and their relationships, it just all felt so authentic right away, and it just seemed like really rare to me to just see that when they meet in the hotel lobby at the beginning of the movie. I was like, I love these guys.
Yeah.
I love them. I did like through and through the complexity, the history, the troubles they were having, the way they would, ride each other, give each other a hard time, all the subtleties that the actors brought to the character. I mean, Spike Lee may lack subtlety, but he leans on the subtlety of these actors, and it works. I mean, you just look at some of the responses, the expressions, wordless expressions that like Clark Peters gives Delroy Lindo, and Delroy Lindo gives other characters, and it's just you see the history, you see the unspoken pain and grief, and all of them, mainly Clark Peters and Delroy Lindo's characters, have kind of secrets that they're not talking about, and you kind of you understand after a while. And I love how we're finding out stuff about them as the movie goes along, and I think cinematically, I really appreciate how the flashbacks are brought in, at first I was a little curious. Oh, right away I was really curious. Is like, okay, so we're not having younger versions of these characters back in the flashbacks, and I'm like, you know what? I'm okay with that because it almost feels like we're in the minds of these guys now as we're looking back, and they are their age back into their memories. They're still the same age, you know. So that that kind of makes sense, and it's kind of fitting because you want to stay with these characters the whole way through. At least I did, and that's interesting for me because typically I want to see a younger version of these characters and then see the difference. But I really appreciated sticking with these characters, and it because I was hooked with them. I was right on board with them being their age in the flashbacks. So at first, when I saw all these other kind of storylines coming into play, or at least characters, I was thinking, are we going to be straying from what really matters here? At least in my mind, what really mattered, was the title characters. Is Jean Reno and this French element, is that going to kind of get in the way? Is that going to be believable enough? The threat in the jungle, is that going to feel tacked on or heavy-handed? And honestly, I mean, I was all on board with it the whole way through because what was hooking me all the way through were these characters and what decisions were they going to make and how were they going to deal with each other. And they were all stressed out. I mean, there's a couple things that maybe I thought was a little convenient. Like I felt like they kind of found the gold a little too fast. It's like, wait, okay, wow, all right. But, that helps the story keep on moving, and it's already 2.5 hours. But, yeah, man, I just, I was watching this movie, and my chest got heavy, and my it was just, my heart hurt for these guys. And, I was just really impressed with the characters that were fleshed out and the acting through and through. And, I could be nitpicky about some storytelling elements, but ultimately I could say that it's a timely movie. It's a movie that I feel like I really needed right now. And yeah, it was really powerful.
Cool. How about you, EMan?
Yeah, I'll mirror a lot of what David said. The funny thing is, like, I guess I'll start with my bad stuff first, but it's very minor, because I did overall enjoy this movie. The aging thing was a distraction at first, and it took a while to get used to it, because the whole time I'm like, wait, are we doing the Irishman thing and the budget just ran out and we couldn't afford the de-aging, or
Good.
are we supposed to believe that they're younger here? So again, it's a little distracting. I want to say for like the first, I don't know, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, it took a while for me to just be like, all right, whatever. Clearly we're just not doing the younger actor thing. Fine. So minor gripe, nothing major. And I think the only other one was, and it's not so much a personal issue for me, but I could see it maybe being a distraction for other viewers who are not adept to Spike Lee's style, which is when these characters kind of go on these monologues. So like when Lindo was going off and he was just having his moment in the jungle and everything. I could easily see that as being a scene as you could have cut that out, but at the same time, it's a fantastic performance.
Yes.
I mean, if we were on a Broadway play or something, like that scene right there is going to be, like part of the bread and butter of it all. So, now I get to shift into the good stuff. I mean, for me, it was all the performances, right?
Yeah.
The characters were I thought they had really good chemistry together. Clearly, Lindo's performance stands out the most. But I also think that his character had the most to work with, especially when he had to deal with the PTSD. That on top of being a war vet on top of being black, on top of politics. Like, that was a smorgasbord for any actor to just dive right into. And I thought he handled it exceptionally well. And I know we'll get into the themes later on, but with Jonathan Majors, I love the whole idea of him coming on, and it took me a while to appreciate what his character was doing, because at first I was like, oh, he just wants some gold, he just wants some treasure. But then it was like, no, he's actually seeking his father's love and approval. And I'm just like, wow, like that's actually pretty deep, given the fact that, like, that's always been like a strange issue within black culture, the lack of a father figure, and trying to chase that, and so on and so forth. So I loved how that was done. Again, some people might differ with the stylistic opinions, but I liked how Spike is being Spike in terms of how, I guess, aggressive and abrasive he is with, I want to show you this. And he's going to put it all in your face. He's going to go from movie to slideshow presentation to documentary to welcome to the historic, museum presentation. Like, you're going to get something from this, and he's going to make sure you get it. But yes, there are other little things I could nitpick at as well. Like maybe that the chicken scene on the boat probably could have been trimmed a little bit, but whatever. I liked where it led to eventually, and the payoffs, I think, are where this movie does satisfy. For a while going into the movie, I want to say for the first two acts, I was a little concerned about, like, where are we going with this? Is this just going to be a soul searching, type of deal? What are they going to do when they meet Chadwick Boseman's, remains, or when they get to that point? Like, where does this story go from there? I know in other conversations, David, you were talking about how, like, you don't mind, just getting to know characters. I'm the complete opposite. I need to know you, but I need to know the story too, because I'm not your friend like that. Like, I came to know what the story is, and it helps. It helps to get to know you, but I still want to know where this is all going. And I like the fact that by the third act, we actually get, a climax and some, action and something that, if you were starting to doze off, this would wake you up.
You just got to be patient.
So, and you got to be patient. And, fun little tidbit. Originally, this movie was actually supposed to be 3 hours long.
I'd take it.
And Spike did not want to cut it at all, which I understand, because something interesting with him, and I guess you can kind of tell actually with that chicken on a boat scene, speaking of which, he doesn't mind allowing actors to improv and to just create. And if it's something good, he'll leave it in there and he'll fight to keep it in there. So knowing that, it gives me a different sense of appreciation, because I think when the director's intentions, it kind of forces you to look at what they actually put out there a little bit differently versus if you just go in there cold. So I definitely appreciated that overall. But yeah, I mean, the film was interesting. I think the strongest things were definitely the character performances and the themes, and clearly the messaging that Spike always wants to make sure he gets across, whether it be political, societal, or whatever. But yeah, overall, good movie. I don't know if I'd have the patience to watch it again. And it's only because of the length. Outside of that, if there was an abridged version, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I had a good sitting through it. I thought they addressed a lot of good things and topics, but I'm good after that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to see it again. I think sort of what you're saying, EMan, is now that I know where it's all going and that it's actually going somewhere, because especially it's kind of like The Irishman, which was that 3.5 hours? It's one of those things where you're watching a movie, how long it is going in. So you're just sitting there hoping to strap in and have it be a breezy thing. But when it's going off in all these different directions, and there are kind of like these valleys and peaks, you're kind of wondering, how long am I going to be going through the valley before I get up to one of those peaks? I will say the third act, we're kind of in disagreement in this, mostly because I like good action as much as anybody else, but I'm also big into character. And this is where my kind of issue with this being three movies shoved into one comes in. We've seen this movie before. We haven't seen it from this perspective, but we've seen, Three Kings. We've seen, kind of like a Dirty Dozen thing. We've seen the people going in, like a military group or whatever, going after treasure or going to find something, and then there's a standoff. I mean, this movie very much is like a black version of The Wild Bunch in some ways. I think, like, at the end, when Paul goes off into the woods on his, or the jungle on his own, after having officially disowned his son, following an ambush by some Vietnamese gangsters, I guess. Yeah. That was the last, I think, battle scene that I needed, because when Paul gets cornered by a subset of that gang, and they're forcing him to dig his own grave, and we get that beautiful monologue just before that. After that's over, it's such a release, and not that it's a good thing, but this whole film has sort of been building towards this moment. But then we have this whole other 20 minutes when we go back to the temple that the rest of the group is holing up in, because they know there's more of this Vietnamese gang coming after them with weapons and vehicles and stuff. I'm like, oh, that's right. We still have to get through the siege movie portion of this movie. And I've seen it all before. And it's pretty well done. I mean, there's the one guy jumps on the grenade, which is a nice callback to that, historical jump in we got earlier in the film. But it seemed like I would have been good watching that movie. I also would have been good watching the full version of the other movie that I had started watching, of these guys just doing some soul searching, going through Vietnam. It kind of like is, Apocalypse Now is referenced very early on in the film, where it's this giant banner in this
dance club,
in this Hanoi nightclub or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's a strong image, and the Ride of the Valkyries, and the use of music in this movie is unbelievable, because we also get Marvin Gaye's What's Going On kind of a cappella. It's a very stirring and emotional film on its own. It gets me that action movie vibe without firing a shot, and I just kind of wished it stayed that way. It's not my movie, of course. It's Spike Lee's movie, but if there is a version where you could watch to skip to different parts, kind of like what you were saying, EMan, you don't want to watch the entire thing again necessarily, I'd be skipping right back to Delroy Lindo's soliloquy. I love the chicken boat thing. I think it does go on for, maybe a minute or two too long, because I kind of get the point, but it does reinforce, kind of like going back to Do the Right Thing, where at the end of that movie, Sal, who up until that point had been ostensibly the least racist appearing character in the movie, his racism comes out, when he's yelling all these things at Radio Raheem before and during, when he smashes his boombox. In this film, even though Paul comes out, he's a Trump supporter, he's very uncomfortable being back in country, but he kind of made this vow to, his friends, and he's also in it for the money. On that boat, he starts bringing out all the Vietnamese slurs and talking about all this, war shit, and everything kind of comes to the surface. It's very powerful stuff, because we're used to seeing movies where it's the white guy having the racist outburst against somebody. We don't necessarily get that from, the black perspective, and it's kind of, shocking. But you also realize what this war did to everybody who fought in it, on kind of both sides of the equation, and within those sides, the divisions. I love that tidbit about the black soldiers being sent into the front of any of the formations to basically take the bullets, to run point. It's terrible and it's sad, but I was also wondering, did Paul feel this way about the Vietnamese before he, was sent over there? The movie opens with Muhammad Ali's famous, interview where he's talking about he was against the war because, nobody in Vietnam had ever called him a racial slur, or, basically stomped on him. So it brings up all these wonderful ideas in the subtext and the context that I would have rather taken that 40 minutes or 45 minutes with the bomb crew, with the shootout at the end, and just gone into some of these themes a bit more. I would love to see that 3-hour cut. Do you know if that cut exists and he trimmed it down to 2:30, or is it was originally going to be 3 hours and they just left a bunch of stuff out, didn't even film it? Your mic. Oh, there you go.
Right. Yeah, I'm not too sure about the details. I just know that originally it was supposed to be about 3 hours, but he kind of conceded, obviously, to get it down.
Was this originally going to be a Netflix thing, or was this going to be theatrical?
Oh no. It was always. I mean, I think it was always Netflix in the same vein as Irishman, in the same vein as I need funding to do this. Netflix is willing to do it, so that partnership worked itself out.
I would really like to see it on the big screen. I wouldn't mind, and I do think it's going to get some Oscar buzz. I could see this definitely. I could see it definitely up for Best Actor for Delroy Lindo, but I would love to see it up for Best Picture. Who knows what the Oscar is going to look like next year? I don't know, but especially talk about zeitgeist. Spike Lee, didn't know what 2020 was going to look like, but here is a timely movie, and it is a really it's. I would say it's definitely obviously a Black perspective, but it's also this universal perspective of grief and loss and connection. It really, they're going back to Hanoi, to Nam, to reconnect to something that scarred them, but also their friendships, to reconnect with these guys who had each other's back, who would die for each other. And is it going to be the same? Probably not. Can they recapture that? Probably not. Maybe. Things happen. And it is. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Trying to stay connected with a friendship for a long time, and maybe trying to reconnect after things have happened. Also, this feeling of guilt. Specifically what Paul goes through, what we learn, what he's gone through all these years. This feeling of guilt for, basically, killing the lead character, Storm and Norman, accidentally. Man, that scene at the end where he sees Storm and Norman, that was just amazing. That's when you look at that moment, that's what he was wanting all these years.
Yep.
And that's just it's right up there with It's Not Your Fault from Good Will Hunting for me. It's just like, that's something that he needed to hear. I forgive you as an accident. It's like, oh my gosh. But yeah, I mean, this is such a, we can talk about what could have been trimmed out and all that, in the logistics of certain things happening, but you talk about where these characters go throughout their journey. Definitely, specifically, Lindo's Paul. I mean, he's such a complex character, and you could understand where he's going through, or what he's going through, and where he's been. But at the same time, you just feel so bad for him, because these other guys are really trying to be there for him and love up on him and be there for him. But a lot of times he makes it so hard, even on his son, and that fractured relationship with his son is just so hard. I mean, yeah, it kind of like what Ian was saying is, first I didn't know what to make of the son. Like, okay, what's going on with this guy? Or maybe
EMan made that point.
EMan made that point, yeah. And at first I was like, but there was an interesting moment where, and maybe it was in that Victoria bar where he meets the French woman. It was at that point where the character just felt like he was just like, you know, kind of like chilling out and being himself, and just we actually get to know him. And I think that there's certain moments throughout the movie with certain characters that that Spike, you know, really gives us a chance to just chill with these guys and sit with these guys and you know, really understand them and get to know them a little bit more, and that really helps. And maybe the length kind of does, you know, the characterizations a service in that sense. Um, but I actually did watch. I did go back and watch a little bit of the opening, just because I like to see, especially in a movie like this, like hints of what's to come in like an opening. And one thing I realized while I was watching the movie and while I was reopening or rewatching the opening is I think too often in war movies we just see the American perspective, and we rarely get a chance to, you know, see the other side, the quote unquote enemy. But here we start with some stock footage of, you know, you mentioned Ali's interview, and then there's, you know, clips from, you know, African-American soldiers either having chow together or going through the jungle. And then we see also, you know, Kent State shooting. And then we see, you know, the violent shooting and results of bombing in Nam of the Vietnamese. And, you know, Spike, obviously we realize it's like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing here, that the violence is all around. It affects everybody. And there's one scene probably maybe in the middle of the movie during a flashback that really made me feel good about how Lee was presenting the entire story, but particularly the Vietnamese side of the story. Is the Five Bloods are in the thick of the jungle, and they're advancing, and you know, as you may know, I watch movies with subtitles, and you start to see, or you start to hear, and from my perspective, I start to read this kind of related story that one Vietnamese soldier is telling another Vietnamese soldier, and he's talking about, I think, like a poem maybe that his child is sharing, I think, and you don't see these characters, you just hear them, and it's a great story element because you know that the enemy, quote unquote, again, is coming towards the Five Bloods, and they're not speaking in their own language. We're actually getting it translated for us, which is very rare in a war movie. You know, again, too often it's just you hear their language and that's it, making them kind of inhuman and unidentifiable and a threat. We're here, you know, these soldiers that we don't see are totally humanized, you know, and they just feel real. And next thing we know, the Five Bloods just mow them down. And you know, what's interesting is we, the viewer, are reading what the enemy is saying, and we're also sitting there with the Five Bloods, our American soldiers, and we're realizing that it is kill or be killed, and it is here come our enemies, and we have to shoot them down. But they're not; those characters aren't seeing or reading the situation the way we are. And I think it's an interesting thing that Spike did there, and it's rare for a war movie to do that. I think maybe the only other war movie, well, there's been a couple, but the only other war movie I can recall right away that gives subtitles to, you know, a foreign enemy would be maybe Letters from Iwo Jima, Clint Eastwood's movie, primarily because that's a focused Japanese perspective. But I really appreciated that perspective, and even the other Vietnamese characters involved in the movie. We get their kind of guide, Vin. He feels really, you know, kind of fleshed out, and I would say a character like that would be more of an ancillary character usually, typically in a movie like this, even more so. Hey, well, I'll drop you off and pick you up, but he seems a lot more, kind of interested and involved and willing to go the extra mile to help these guys. Sure, he's getting paid, but still, it just seems like he's a lot more, kind of invested in them. But yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I just picked up that right away. I really felt like appreciative of that inclusion.
Yeah, and that scene in the jungle stuck out to me too. In that, those Vietnamese soldiers could have been talking strategy as much as they could have been talking about their day. I mean, what we essentially witnessed potentially was the Vietnamese version of the Five Bloods getting mowed down, by by our quote unquote heroes. It's there's a lot of really complicated stuff going on in this film. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's an important Vietnam War movie, not only because of the after effects of what has happened to these guys over the decades. One of them is an alcoholic, another has an OxyContin, addiction. One has, everybody thinks he's the most successful guy out of the group. He's rich, but he's lost everything. And this is sort of his last chance to have a human connection, but also to get some money to maybe get his life back together.
Right.
They don't spend too much time on all of that, and I'm kind of fine with it because there's so much to unpack with Paul's character. My one reservation, and maybe this won't be as emphasized when I watch it again, is as much as I love Delroy Lindo, and I don't want to accuse him of showboating because I think it was the direction. It's just he's given so much meat that he borders on chewing scenery. He's got so many like there are at least 15 scenes in this movie that could be used in the Oscar clip,
Sure.
And again, it's not that it's bad. He's terrific in this, and I think he's got a complex character. But I'm like, there's some others. There's three other people behind you.
I think that was all just Spike showing favoritism. Like him and Delroy go back
way back
since Crooklyn.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. So I think it was just I fell in love with Lindo. So Lindo, you do whatever you want. I think that was the sentiment.
Sure.
And I didn't mind that at all because I've appreciated Lindo for so long that I was just like, man, you do your thing. You deserve this, because there's too many times where I would watch a movie and I'm like, maybe he had a supporting role and I thought you deserve a better movie than this. But it's like, here we go. I mean, watch him and Get Shorty again. I mean, that was just freaking amazing. It's just, but he's always so good. I mean,
speaking of Get Shorty, I always think of him, that one line in that movie, because it's a movie about the movie biz.
Right.
And he says at one point, "I've seen better film on teeth."
Well, it's funny you mention that because I like the kind of commentary that these four guys are having about, Hollywood's version of Vietnam in Hollywood. It's like, especially the 80s, the Rambo and the Chuck Norris movies, Missing in Action and the Rambo movies. And they're like, man, it's like none of that stuff's real. And, and it, sure. The thing is, I'm sitting there watching this. I'm like, well, I kind of like those movies, but I like this stuff too. It's like, I get it. It's superheroized, POW type of 80s movies, but it is cool to hang with these guys and look back as they're talking. They're going back to a place, 50 years later. They're also, kind of criticizing movies that are 30 years old about their time in Nam and stuff, so it's like, I'm on board with you guys. I hear you, but it's also Lee, and the screenwriters, kind of criticizing those movies too.
Yeah,
sort of. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I did like that critique. I thought it was very funny, but kind of like what we were discussing before at the end, and it's very brief, thank goodness. It kind of becomes one of those movies where they've got the big standoff of like everyone's showing up with the guns and you take point over here and we've got one magazine left kind of a thing, and you got the one guy who's injured, and and that's why I kind of again, I can't fault him for it, because as much as I thought that was kind of cliched and not that interesting, we were so invested in these characters. I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, fine, I'll watch him go through a siege.
Right,
You
right.
know?
I mean, I wanted to be there with them the whole way through, you know, and I knew that was okay. When, as soon as they say, "Well, there's a temple over there," I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be the standoff,
Right,
you know.
right.
It's like I get that. I mean, even the fact, as soon as the French woman mentioned that she and those two other guys are with a kind of seek and destroy mission to, you know, basically scrap up all these mines that are still out there. I'm like, oh, that's going to play a factor later on, you know. And the fact,
you exist.
yeah, and the fact that, you know, Isaiah Whitlock Jr.'s character, when they're looking for the gold, he's the main guy with the metal detector, and then in the French trio, you know, bomb squad, we'll call him, there's another guy with the metal detector. I'm like, this is going to come to a head, and it's not going to be good. And those mines were like the most intense part for me. It was like, oh my gosh, come on, stop, you know.
I think when was his name Peter, the car salesman one?
Yeah, Eddie.
Eddie,
yeah. When I saw him walking backwards and stuff, I was like, oh,
I'm like, will you stop?
That's it.
Come
That's
on.
It.
Spike, what are you doing to us?
You've got the most lines you've ever had. You're walking backwards. I see the shot panning. I saw it coming at that point. But I thought that was a slight miss, because just cut a little bit away from that, and you could have had a better shock moment.
That's what I mean when Spike lacks subtlety, and I get that. You know, I understand that you didn't know it's coming, and it's almost like, you know, Spike has a reverence for kind of, you know, the classic Hollywood tropes, and I think that there's certain things that, you know, he doesn't mind including, and I don't mind it because it definitely builds up suspense and everything. But you're still like, oh man, okay, geez, stop walking backwards.
Right.
I was annoyed because he fell into the rule of three. You know, when they first find the gold with the metal detector, and I only realized this after the scene was over, that the score was playing. I'm like, okay, the big kind of like John Williams, almost Jurassic Park score was going on as they find all the gold that was in the mudslide, right? I'm like, okay, this is really intense. He's got the metal detector. Someone's going to uncover the thing, and it's, you know, going to be a toe popper. Nothing happens.
Right.
And then the next scene is they're in the kind of barren minefield. There's no score. So I'm like, okay, something's going to happen. One of the characters, I think, goes off and is like, oh, this is going to be it. Nope, doesn't happen. And then Eddie, in that scene, he's walking backwards, and then he blows up. I think the aftermath of it and the effect of him, you know, because I thought he got blown to smithereens, but I thought it was
just dust.
Right.
But then you hear him. Oh,
yeah.
Like, that is what landmines do. Like, they're not made. Yeah. They're not made to kill you. They're made to like maim you, and then have the other soldiers come in,
so you can
and they become easier targets. So, it just shows that little ugliness of war a little bit more.
It's definitely it reminded me of the first time I watched Platoon. You know, I was a teenager, and that was the first time I saw like really like graphic maiming and war and everything, and I was like, you know, it's just like, but yeah, that was hard. That was hard stuff.
But I did love, as much as that kind of annoyed me, the scene, or the bit after that concluded the scene, where David, not you, David, David, Paul's son, steps on a landmine, or
stays on a landmine,
stands on it.
Yeah.
And everybody realizes, and they get this ingenious plan to get a rope and tie it around all of them. It's like this giant tug of war that's kind of one-sided, and they all yank. But again, damn it, Delroy Lindo, in that moment where he's looking at his son and he's like telling him exactly what to do, and his son's, you know, kind of shitting his pants, but he's like, you know, where did you go? Morehouse. And he's talking about this. I wrote down
Edwin Moses.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know,
Olympic hurdler.
Yeah, fly like Moses. Jesus. It was so good. Yeah.
And you know, after it happened, I kept on thinking, could that really happen? You know, that's like, wow. You know, I mean, not even like part of a foot that came off or something. You know, it's like,
I kind of question that scene a little bit, only because I don't know if we had enough established between David and Paul to know this is their thing. You know, like maybe they do have these little moments, these little father-son moments, which are very small in particular, to be like, hey, this is how and where we bond. I'm going to channel that in this very intense situation to get you refocused. And because we didn't have that, it just kind of felt a little superficial, like, all right, here comes the history lesson or whatever, and we just have to take it.
The way I saw it is, even if that was the first time they had that talk, it was believable to me because of the direness of the situation. And, you know, later on when we learned what happened to David's mom, you know, Paul's wife, the fact that she basically died giving birth to him, we're kind of left to believe maybe it didn't happen, maybe it did, that Paul pretty much raised David. And then after a while, there was a falling out and they split. You know, so maybe they had that talk growing up as a kid. I don't know. But, you know, those kinds of confrontations, you know, but like to me, you know, if that maybe I'd like to believe that maybe that was the first time that, you know, they had that kind of a heart to heart confrontation, you know, adrenaline running, hearts beating, you know, sweat profusely. You know, it's just like, This is it. And I just love like back and forth throughout really the entire movie, except for the coda at the end. You know, Paul's all over the place with how he feels about David. I mean, he mostly just doesn't. Yeah, he's mostly very resentful. But I think the resent is more towards himself, we realize. And obviously he loves his son, and that's why he gathered everybody together to try and save him. But I think that he hated what he did to his son, but he put that out in a different way. It came out in different ways.
Well, yeah, because he's carrying that guilt of having, you know, killed Norman. So just having to wrestle with that alone and not being able to talk to anybody or get any kind of closure because of that guilt, that's very much something that could preoccupy somebody out of being a good father, and then having that misplaced anger, and who knows what else was going on, you know, in his life. I'm curious to find out if he was a lifelong Republican, or what, you know, compelled him to become a Trump supporter.
That's interesting.
Now I do want to talk about this a little bit because Jean Reno shows up at the beginning of the movie, and then he shows up at the end as kind of like he's pulling the strings, and there's some question about, oh my gosh,
his working relationship with Tian.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, does she know about this plot and all that stuff? He's ultimately trying to rip everybody off, and he shows up at the very end. It's the most unsubtle wardrobe choice as far as theme. Since Bonnie and Clyde, when the sheriff shows up at the end dressed all in black, he's showing up all in white with the bloody red MAGA hat on. He looks almost exactly like Donald Trump does when he goes golfing. And to the point where, if you want to dig really deep into it, he's, you know, exploiting he's exploiting people of different races than he is to get what he wants. I don't know where exactly Lee was going with this. There is a lot of, you know, anti-Trump sentiment throughout the film, and he didn't. I don't know. There's like this weird tick that I have watching it is Paul was the only person out of the group that, you know, gave an indication that he was a Trump supporter, that he even considered voting Republican, whatever that means. But he's also the most unhinged kind of lunatic who needs the most help. I don't know if Lee was working on that level, but I can just imagine someone watching this movie who is perhaps not on that political persuasion that Lee is on, and being like, all right, I get it. This is an attack on me. You know, I don't know if that's warranted or, you know, even on his mind, but it just seemed a bit off. Even to the point where they showed the famous clip of the Trump rally with the one black guy in the background. There's a giant red glowing arrow in the back. And it's, you know, it's cute, but I also thought about that. I'm like, and this commentary comes up later in the film during the bar scene where the one guy is standing up talking about the Klansman in chief in the White House, and, you know, no black people voted for Donald Trump except you. I'm like, Well, that's not true. And also, if you reverse the races on that and take it back to, say, the 1960s, the era that, kind of birthed this movie in the Vietnam War, you had people say in the Deep South, if you were white and you were seen to be talking to black people and believing in their cause and stepping outside those political boundaries, you could also be very much hated. I just thought it was a bit of an easy criticism, and maybe that's all he wants to go for, and that's not exactly what the movie's about. I kind of want to see a movie about Spike Lee addressing the Trump era, which maybe we'll get in 10 years after this is all over.
It's getting there, I'm sure.
I think for Spike, first of all, Spike is not a fan of Trump. Like,
get out of here.
I know. Breaking news. That's what I'm here for, guys.
Man.
That is.
Did you find out that by interviewing him? Because
I did actually. I got confirmation. So this is firsthand knowledge here, guys.
Wow.
But yeah,
I was
he's not a fan. So
it took an interview, huh?
It did. Not like Black Klansman or any other movies, but so I mean that is there, right? However, what I found interesting with not only Spike's commentary, but just how he treated the character, because I was trying to listen to Paul and how he was dealing, like how the character himself was wrestling with being a Trump supporter, because there are a number of different conflicting things that happen with just the black community and Trump supporters. So there's that dynamic. But then you also have the military dynamic and how that could be an emphasis. Excuse me. And what I liked about Paul is that I don't think that his eccentricism, I guess, or the crazier side of him, I don't think that is what was like tagged with him being a Trump supporter. If anything, he was more like, I like the guy because he's candid. I like Trump because he says and does whatever he wants to do. And that was Paul. So Paul was able to resonate with, and reconcile his political similarities with Trump because they were also personal characteristics he could identify with. So I thought in that sense, that was a fair and accurate portrayal, because there are a number of Trump supporters out there that are like, you know what? I might not agree with this or that, but I like his candor, or I like the fact that he gets this done and stuff. And regardless of where you fall politically, if that's your go-to, then that's your go-to. And I thought that, Lee at least was fair enough to include that, because let's be honest, it would have been a lot easier for him not to have a Paul character at all. It would have been a lot easier for him to just have, a bunch of, African-Americans dealing with being Vietnam, veterans. And that dynamic in itself is complex already. But to add that other layer, and I thought to treat it somewhat, and I'm talking about treat it fairly in respect to Paul, not how other people criticize Paul or attacked him, or how, like you brought up the scene with the arrow and everything. Like, that's Spike. You know what I'm saying? That's when Spike's voice of God kind of comes in and he puts his own thing. But I thought he treated the character and his ideology fair in terms of how it was portrayed.
That's a good point. And it's something I didn't really pick up on until listening to you to, make that defense, is the fact that, online I see every day, especially in the last, call it 2.5 weeks, people, friends of mine and quote unquote friends, like in the Facebook sense, saying things like, if you are a Republican, or if you support Trump, if you voted for him, if you're thinking about voting for him, unfriend me right now. I want nothing to do with you. Get out of my life. And that's not to give away anything in terms of my own political leanings, but I will say what Spike Lee does in this movie that's beautiful, and I think you pointed it out, EMan, is Paul feels this way. He's outspoken about it. His friends know this. And I don't think it's just the Vietnam thing, but they're true friends. They're not like, oh yeah, Paul went off the rails. He voted for, Mr. MAGA hat. We're not going to invite him on this trip. They'd still die for him. And
they went to war together. They got a deeper bond than anything.
Dude, I'm telling, I've
Yeah.
seen families break up over
Yeah.
this guy,
Yeah.
over Trump 45. So it's, so I don't know. Again, I'd have to sit down and talk to Spike Lee about this kind of stuff. Get Spike on the couch to find out if he was even thinking on that level.
Well,
But it is
yeah.
something that's kind of there if you look for it.
And there's other screenwriters involved too. So I'm wondering at what point, did all this come up and who was involved in what?
Yeah.
I at least contextually, in the end, I feel like we get an idea of how he came to vote for Trump and be a supporter, in a way, because there is a mention. I mean, it's funny because these four guys get together, reunite, regardless of where they are in life right now, regardless of who voted for who, because I think that they were kind of surprised in the nightclub to find out that he voted for Trump. It's like, what? No, you voted. What did it say? President fake bone spurs.
Yep.
And the thing is it's just another topic that they're all kind of ribbing each other about. And that's nothing would break up these guys really. I mean, eventually something does, but yeah, I feel and Paul mentions the whole build a wall thing and controlling the immigrants coming in. And I think that, I mean, that kind of thing, the whole reason that he accidentally killed Storm and Norman, his best friend, is because, there was somebody who was shooting at them. And that somebody was, again, the enemy, Vietnamese soldier. So, of course, he can relate that to let's not let those people in. Let's build that wall because let's look what happened when we were against these, when I was in Nam, and look what happened when I was against these people, and he has this these emotional scars that, kind of builds this picture in his mind and builds his mind frame. So it's understandable how he would, kind of take that point of view, I guess. And this whole illusion of make America great again, it's almost like something that he could grasp onto. And he alludes throughout the film of how, effed up his life has been all these years. And it doesn't really get into all the details as to how or why, but I think it all stems down to that guilt, of killing Storm and Norman accidentally. And from then on, it was effed up, and it was because of this war. And now it's not just, those memories. It's physically manifests itself in panic attacks and PTSD, and he lives with this every day. He dreams, he has nightmares of the ghosts that visit him. Storm and Norman talks to him every night. So it's like, here's this loudmouth white guy promising to make America great again. Maybe that's something he could latch onto that could,
See,
I
I think another element with Paul's character is just, especially with Norman, because Norman, given the ideologies that we see he tries to teach to the other veterans, he clearly wouldn't have been a Trump supporter at that point, and they kind of made Norman, I don't want to say like a divine figure, but it was someone
I would say that, yeah.
I would say he's like Jesus. Black
I mean,
Jesus.
Paul kind of revered him, a lot.
Paul Revere, I get
it. And I think the dynamic that kind of sticks out to me with Paul and his political ideologies, but then coming as a follower of Norman, there's a disconnect. There's a cognitive dissonance that's happening with him. So yes, he might support a Trump ideology, policy, politics or whatever, but that's not what he actually believed. But he has never reconciled that.
Right.
The same way he's never reconciled what's happened with him internally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, with the situation with Norman and all. And it wasn't until he had that come to Jesus moment, with Norman, that he finally found some closure. So, I just thought that it was a little bit indicative of his character that because he has all this lack of reconciliation in the other parts of his life, he's probably going to exhibit that in other areas as well, including maybe his political ideologies.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's another thing that just listening to you guys talk about this kind of bubbled up in my head. The idea of these four guys going back to Vietnam, revisiting, the site of this tragedy 50 years on, they're looking for their friend who, in all these flashbacks, he is almost a religious, spiritual figure, or at least he's become that in their minds. Maybe in the same way that they can only see him the way that we see him as this, 27-year-old, lean Chadwick Boseman. Back in the 1960s and the 70s and even, thereafter, we've lost black leaders to assassination, left and right. Everybody's just kind of wiped out. And there's sort of a vacuum of, modern day aspirational figures that everybody can kind of recognize and get behind. I mean, the closest we came was, Barack Obama, and even he's, been a divisive figure in some circles. In terms of, they're looking for something. They're looking for leadership. They're looking for guidance today, and they kind of have to go back into the past to find the last time they really connected with someone who made them feel that they could be, more than what they were and really do something. So I feel like since they're all sort of lost and messed up at, 50 years after this war, it's not only a reflection of what Vietnam did to them, but the lack of, leadership and what the country did to the cause.
Yeah.
If I might step down from my white guy soapbox.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, like you guys are saying. I mean, it is. I would call him kind of a divine figure. But that is the color of their lens. That's how they saw him. And they were pretty much. It is like kind of Jesus hanging with his disciples. I mean, they were. A lot of times they were just living and breathing, hanging out with this guy, and teaching them all about, a way of life and a history while trying to live and stay alive,
survive. Yeah.
Survive. So it's like, wow, I mean, you get a survival. You're forced to rely on each other. You get survival skills. You get the life lessons, and that stuff. It'll never part from you, because that's what kept you alive, yeah.
And unfortunately, I can't. Was David the only one to really walk away from this of the Bloods? I think everybody else died, didn't they?
No.
No.
Did.
Otis.
Who did?
Otis
survived.
The doctor medic.
Yeah.
The one that was
Otis with the
oh, that's right.
Yeah, with the daughter.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, by the way, the Five Bloods were named after the original Temptations.
Oh, that's what they were originally called?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, that's funny because they mentioned David Ruffin. He mentions David Ruffin in the Temptations.
There you go.
He's like, David, like in the Bible, he's like David Ruffin from the Temptations.
Okay, so I stand corrected. So at least two of this crew made it back to civilization. So there is some hope that what they kind of discovered out there, they could bring back and hopefully use to inspire other people. And we do see at the end, this gold being kind of redistributed to, causes that people can really get behind. It's not like they took it and lived high on the hog. I mean, it's a really nice, again, a hopeful message.
I mean, there are some things that are left kind of lingering, wondering how did that work out? Like, how did they explain? Why do I keep forgetting his name? Eddie. How do they explain Eddie's demise? And do they ever do that?
Broken ankle.
Right. And eventually they, right away they pretty much told the truth to Vin because they needed his help. But how did they get the remains? It seemed like they got the remains of Norman back to the U.S. to give him a burial at Arlington. that kind of stuff. I was just left wondering, but then I'm like, it's movie stuff.
There was a line of dialogue early on about, once they found Norman's remains, they had some kind of a contact that they'd be able to call in and take care
Yeah,
of it. So I
yeah,
assume they did the same thing with Eddie. They probably just said, "Hey, we were looking for our friend, and he stepped on a landmine because this country is full of them."
yeah.
They didn't have to know anything about the gold.
Right.
I did wonder if Eddie had paid up and everything and signed on the dotted line for that hotel, because he footed the bill for the entire trip.
Hey, it's on
Well,
that credit card.
it's on that rubber credit card.
The black Amex, yes.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
Mm.
I think we pretty well covered the Five Bloods. Is there anything that you want to end with? Anything that we've missed?
Well, I mean, I found myself, this morning I was playing the score by Terrence Blanchard. I thought it was, Blanchard's worked with Spike Lee a lot, and he did a great job in Black Klansman as well. But it's you mentioned the John Williams kind of sweeping score, and it is not just the songs are great in the movie, but I think the score is pretty powerful in parts. Sometimes it's a little heavy-handed, but I didn't mind it. It has a little bit of those military tinges with the trumpets here and there, and it reminded me of kind of like as much as they were making fun of the Rambo movies, it reminded me of a hint of the Jerry Goldsmith Rambo score. And yeah, I mean it definitely, listening to again this morning, and that definitely made me contemplate things about the movie, and I think that's a kind of testament of a good score to pull you back into the movie like that. And that's what I've always appreciated about good scores. But yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway for me and what'll bring me back to watching the movie is I want to hang out with these guys again. And I really like the choice of casting because, I mean, the most recognizable is probably for most people, Joe moviegoers, probably Delroy Lindo out of all of them. But man, we get two veterans from The Wire, Isaiah Whitlock Jr. and Clark Peters, and he even had that line.
I cracked up so hard.
And man, I want to see how many takes he did of that, because that was, I mean, how do you keep a straight face?
I don't know.
He is the originator and the king of that line.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that by other people in other movies and mediums or whatever, but he is just so good at that. It just rolls out. And just why he said it, because throughout the whole movie they're arguing about who much gets what part of the gold and the shares and this and that, and it just keeps on getting spread out the more people that are involved, and it's just like, man, he was like, she, so good, so just under his breath. But I would have liked maybe a little bit more time to get to know the Melvin and Eddie characters, Isaiah Whitlock Jr. and Norm Lewis. But, it's hard to do that with four characters, and give them a fair share. But I think they were believable characters. And even you're thinking oh man, these 60-something-year-olds are going to, hang out in the temple and take out these soldiers, but I think what made that believable was not having younger actors in the flashback scene, because we saw these actors back in those scenes as they probably remembered themselves, and we saw them in action, and it made sense in that climactic third part. Of course, we know that when David gets handed that gun, we know that there's going to be payoff later on. It's like, okay,
sure.
He's like, I didn't even shot a gun. I don't know how to. Okay, well, we know that that's going to play out, and that's how a lot of the movie is. But I didn't care. I really like this movie. I would say it's not like I've seen a whole lot of memorable 2020 movies, but I still have a lot to catch up with. But man, I feel like this is the best movie I've seen so far this year.
Nice.
High praise.
Yeah.
All right. What about you, EMan? Final thoughts.
Look, you know what? The things that last with me the most are definitely going to be the themes that were explored. I mean, we have yet to see a solid film really addressed the complexity between being black in America, patriotism, and the hypocrisy in how that just never really blends, or it never really meets. Just the fact that it's such a disturbing and yet still foretelling issue that has permeated itself even till today's times, where even if you're black and you serve in the country, for your country, you still can be discriminated against. And that's something that we thought would have been resolved so long ago. And in the interview with Spike, he was talking about how other veterans would come up to him who saw the movie and been like, what took you so long to tell this story? Because this is the only time I think we even come close to talking about this in respect to film is probably with Muhammad Ali. That's the only time we really talk about being black and dealing with war and being a veteran. And and it's like, I like that this personalized the story a little bit more. And on top of that, like, I liked how, because we get down to that granular level with Paul's character, I'm always empathetic when we see the damaging effects of war, because war is nothing natural. Like, people are not made to go to war. Like, it's really a psychologically damaging thing. And I like the fact that we get to see that, so we can really see, like, just how bad this can be, not just for a society, but on a person on a very, singular level. And yeah, so yes, the whole being black, serving for your country, and still not being, accepted, that dynamic, even going overseas, and how some of the Vietnamese people were kind of like, we know it wasn't your fault, or, how David mentioned, like, the changing of perspective, like how they don't even really say the Vietnamese war. They say it's, the American war, and like how that gets flipped around. Like I mentioned earlier, the father-son dynamic. I mean, there's so much to unpack in just that, I'm not sure if it was really emphasized enough, for non-black viewers, because that wasn't the main premise of the movie. But like I talked about, the father-son dynamic is something that is not always explored within the black community and the black perspective. And even though it was kind of overshadowed with the PTSD in Paul's character, there's still a problem with black fathers and their sons, and being able to just communicate on an emotional level. That's something that is still a stigma, that I like it when it's put out there, because it is something that needs to also be confronted and, to hopefully be resolved, because there's always some sort of trauma from the older generation and they don't know how to process it. So they just make do. But then when the newer generation comes along, there's this disconnect in communication, which we kind of see with both characters. And even though it wasn't like, a deep dive into it, I still like that it was there. But that was definitely something that I could kind of resonate with and connect to, and I appreciated that Spike threw that in there. But my I guess my biggest hope at the end of the day is, with this film, people will take some of those mini history lessons that Spike just kept throwing at you one way or another. And I mean, it was almost like, I'm gonna throw the whole kitchen sink at you, and something's gonna stick. You're hopefully you'll Google one name, and find out something about, whatever went on. But I appreciated the authenticity and the candor that this tried to have, and yeah, overall, pretty good movie.
Yeah, well, I'm right there with you, and there's been a lot of talk about especially white people, taking a moment to listen and hear what black people have to say and read books and watch movies and stuff. I think this is a really great place to start because, as you mentioned, EMan, there's a lot in here. It's almost like a checklist of like, okay, you're watching this movie about this experience. Here's some other people you can go and learn from, and then just kind of like offshoot from there. It's like the the YouTube recommended list sort of thing. But all right, well, we're gonna leave it there. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to talk about this with me. I do want to talk about Malcolm X at some point soon.
Yeah.
So because I'm itching to rewatch that, because that was I think that was his movie after Do the Right Thing.
Right.
I want to see how he's evolved. His evolution between Do the Right Thing and this film. Wow. You're talking about going from dealing in stereotypes to dealing with very specific characters with, passions and histories. It's quite amazing. So again, thanks guys. And yeah, we'll talk real soon.
You're welcome.
All right.
Talk to you later.
All right, bye.